Ingrid Mattson es profesora de Estudios Islámicos y directora de Capellanía Islámica del Centro McDonald para Estudios Islámicos, así como perito de Relaciones Cristiano-Musulmanas en el Seminario de Hartford en Hartford, Connecticut. Ella habla de nutrir un genuino Islam americano enraizado en la fe clásica, misma que data de antes de que los cismas teológicos, políticos y legales fracturaran la UMA, la Comunidad Islámica Universal, hace siglos. Esta fe es la que ella escogió a la edad de 23 años, atraída, dice, por la belleza del Islam, sus etos de servicio y su síntesis de vida y fe en la que cada acto tiene que ver con Dios.
Bienvenidos a un programa más de Dialogando con la Ciudad de las Ideas. Y bueno, el día de hoy tenemos una gran mujer, una persona, y reitero mujer, que es la líder de los musulmanes en Estados Unidos, en Canadá y en México. Realmente la congregación se encuentra en Estados Unidos, pero son mexicanos, canadienses y estadounidenses que creen en el Islam. Lo sorprendente de esto es que la persona que lidera este movimiento islámico es una mujer. Ella nos explicará realmente cuál es la diferencia entre los prejuicios y lo que la gente a veces ha presupuesto de lo que es el islamismo y la mujer y lo que es la realidad. Quédese con nosotros en un programa provocador, porque Ingrid Mattson se encontrará con nosotros en Puebla del 6 al 8 de noviembre para provocarnos hacia dónde ve el Islam, qué conciliaciones y qué diálogo tiene con el otro, con el diferente, por qué esto es relevante para la sociedad y para la humanidad en general. La Ciudad de las Ideas en Puebla y hoy dialogando con la Ciudad de las Ideas en Proyecto 40. Bienvenidos a un programa más de la Ciudad de las Ideas, un programa muy especial donde hoy vamos a hablar con Ingrid Mattson, una mujer involucrada en el mundo musulmán que se ha dedicado a los estudios del cristianismo y del islam, y que por supuesto como mujer y bajo su perspectiva hay mucho que aprenderle. Va a ser muy provocadora esta plática y como ustedes saben, este programa es un preámbulo a este gran festival que tendremos en México del 6 al 8 de noviembre sobre las ideas. Ingrid se va a encontrar hablando y debatiendo con gente de diferentes creencias en ese gran subtítulo, en ese gran tema que es ¿en qué creemos? Y recordemos, no te creas todo lo que piensas. Ingrid, it's an honor to be with you here in New York.
My pleasure.
And you come from Connecticut,
Yes,
no?
that's right.
Thank you. Oh, in your own words, who are you? What do you do for a living? In few words, what do you believe? And then we will start talking. Thank you again for the interview.
Well, you're welcome. I consider myself having 3 jobs. The first one is to take care of my family. I have 2 teenage children and a husband who needs a lot of care as well, as we all know. I have my position as an academic, as a professor. I teach at Hartford Seminary, Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations. And then I am the elected president of the Islamic Society of North America, which is the largest umbrella organization for Muslims in Canada and the United States. And there are a few Muslims from Mexico who come to our events, but not many so far.
How many members do belong to your association?
We represent approximately 100,000 Muslims.
¿Qué líder? You're a leader.
Yes.
What do you think that, why, and if we always make us the same question, why you? Why do you think you were chosen to be the leader?
Well, to some extent, I think it's a natural progression of our community from mostly an immigrant community to Muslims who were born and raised in this country, either second generation or indigenous, meaning that they are from the African American mainly, or some Caucasian, European American
Are you the
Muslims.
first woman that...
I am the first woman, yeah, and I'm the first native-born North American. So I think that reflects the demographics, changing demographics of our community. And more than anything, from more of a ideological perspective, I guess, I think what it shows is that when Muslims are free to choose who they want to be, to organize themselves in whatever way they want without government interference, in a country where they have access to all different ideas in education, that I think is quite interesting that the choice that they will make for a leader is a woman, someone who is educated in a secular and religious context, and who works in a Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. So I think this undermines some of the conceptions or assertions that people make about Muslims, that what they really want is some kind of theocracy or patriarchy, because that's not the choice that North American Muslims have made.
North American Muslims. It's very different the way Muslims in the United States and Canada, and actually the people that you have from Mexico, the Hispanic community in North America, sees the world, their cosmovision, than the Muslims in Far East and in the Middle East?
In some ways, it's true. I think, first of all, we have a more realistic understanding of the West because we live here.
Of the West.
And in a way, the West looms so large in many traditional Muslim countries as a potential threat, or a real threat, in fact, when we've seen the political history of invasion and occupation the last few decades. But it's also sort of this construction that is sometimes a scapegoat, sometimes an elusive enemy, sometimes an object of desire. And living here, we can somehow deal with this issue and get it out of the way with, and then get on to our own identity formation, which is the important challenge for the 21st century. I think one of the mistakes that many people make, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, when they look at Islam, is that they look at a particular historical manifestation or a cultural manifestation of Islam and essentialize it, and confuse that with a kind of universal Islam. The way I approach Islam is that this is an impulse. It's a set of relationships to God and to other people that take different forms over time. And the beauty really is in exploring those different forms, those different perspectives, because in the end, if Islam teaches you anything, it's that we are very limited as human beings in our perspective. The reason why God created us in communities in the world with other people is to learn from the others, and it's by that relationship, by that encounter, by seeing the world from your perspective, that in fact I can approach from very distant place, but I can approach a more comprehensive knowledge of the universe and of being.
I will make, and I have been making the same questions to other people that are coming from different religions. And the first one will be your relation with what we call now the new atheism, that is really re-emerging. We have talked about Richard Dawkins. He has provoked, and he has mentioned, like Freud many years ago, that probably we create God because of our needs, and that science have been proving another culture, another way to see things. How do you read Richard Dawkins and all these new theories?
Well, they make some very good points. They make some points that, in fact, some of our best religious thinkers historically have made, which is that it's very easy for us to confuse our own desires, our own needs, our own will for power with God's will. In fact, the ultimate spiritual challenge is that struggle with yourself. The scholars of the Islamic tradition said that you don't know God if you don't know yourself. So we can benefit, and it's very much in my tradition that we can benefit from psychology, we can benefit from sociology, from knowing how our circumstances and as well as our own upbringing and history, our genetics, how these influence us, how these impact us. But that is, you know, from my perspective, that has nothing to do with belief in God or not, because I see all of this under the rubric of a universe that was God created. And people like Dawkins and others, they use some, they refute some of the more simplistic explanations of God's existence, proof for God's existence, that I simply don't subscribe to. Essentially, in my perspective and from the Islamic perspective, knowledge of God is an internal conviction that is known, not believed in. It's not a leap of faith, but it's a knowledge that is experiential.
Can you argue that the people that don't believe, for example, in God, could be good, could do good, could be in a good world? How could you explain their behavior, or you don't understand them well in that sense?
No, absolutely. And in fact, according to Islamic theology, all human beings are born good and with an internal sense of right and wrong. Islam doesn't believe in original sin. But at the same time, we don't believe that people are born outside of history. So that a human being who comes into the world has no burden of sin, but is immediately formed by whether the mother is attentive and loving or is negligent or abusive. Immediately that potential for goodness to grow is either pushed back and crippled, or it is nurtured. And so what that means is that, for my understanding, from an Islamic perspective, there's no way for any of us to not be responsible for the spiritual and emotional formation of others, because collectively we have to create a world in which human beings are nurtured, are loved.
Just following your words, how do you explain the bad, where it comes from, if we actually are built with this good thing?
Right. Well, you know, we start with this, but we have desires, you know, and these desires, if we do not balance our desire with
So these desires that we're born with,
and that in themselves are neutral.
Are neutral.
Desire
Okay. Now I
for
understand.
desire for love, desire for attention, you know, all of these things. As long as our reason is in balance, to put limits on these, then we're going to be able to fulfill these desires in a way that doesn't hurt other people.
Three things, three principles, three values that probably the West and many people have misunderstood about Muslims. I mean, for example, we have been talking about the role of women. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings that we really have to understand, at least from your perspective. The topic of course, of power and theocracy, and the topic that has to do with who is different, and the war and the values and the causes. I think there's a lot of myths around all these things.
Yes.
If we could start really, and being, I'm sure there are many things from the way I see my own life that I don't like, and I can criticize about my country, about my values, etc. If you could also say, well, this even that I don't like it, it's this way, but here there is a big misunderstanding.
There's no doubt that there are many Muslims who use Islam as a tool to oppress women. That's true. You look across the Muslim world, and when there are acts of violence committed against women, very often it's with a religious justification. Now, why is that? Is it because Islam is more susceptible to that than other religions? I don't think so, because in fact what we see quite clearly from from the Quran and from the story of the Prophet Muhammad is that the message was towards the increasing empowerment of women. He fought very hard to ensure their rights in a highly patriarchal tribal society. But what we have to understand is that Muslims, even at the beginning of the 21st century, tend to be more religious than many Western people. And so when they want to justify anything, good or bad, right, whether it's a political action, whether it's their own behavior, they're going to tend to revert to try to give a religious justification because that's the strongest argument. And so I think this is one of the main challenges for Muslims, is to continue to push back against these religious justifications for abuse, and maybe even in a way stop always using religion even for good arguments or for good policies, because in fact we have shared public interests, we have shared common interests with other people that we don't need to always articulate within a religious framework, because then, you know, it's as susceptible to being manipulated or used for bad policies.
I agree. As well as you mentioned, like in 1 minute, if I mention you the word woman, and I mention now, for example, the relation with Israel, what would you say in 1 minute?
Well, it's very difficult. It's really very difficult, and it is so crucial, I believe, you know, to world peace. Palestinians, although they're a small part of the population of the Muslim world, it is an issue that isn't just about national rights or the rights of a group to achieve their collective rights, but this is the place of holiness. Jerusalem is loved and considered holy by Muslims across the world. So we need to solve this problem. I believe it's possible to solve. And the reason why I believe it's possible to solve is that we've made very good progress recently in the United States in dialogue between American Muslims and American Jews, who tend to be the strongest supporters of the State of Israel. We're having some very difficult conversations that I think are paying off, and I do believe that it's possible in the future for us to come to some kind of...
I don't know if you saw this film, Promises, where kids from Palestine and kids from Israel get together, and all the stereotypes and all the things. And many people mentioned there, and in another debate, that there is a solution, and that the real problem behind everything, more than anything else, is poverty. Poverty in the region, and with poverty comes problems on education, problems on health, problems on the way that you have to always find a scapegoat. Doesn't matter from which side you are, but you have to find a scapegoat. Do you have that kind of paradigm? Do you share it?
I believe that's an important part of it. You simply, with things like water, for example, the more that some people take it, the more that the settlers on the West Bank use it to fill up their swimming pools, the less there is for drinking and for business for the Palestinians. So there are material reasons. But there are ideological reasons as well on all sides. It's absolutely true. There are Muslims who believe that it is absolutely impossible for them from a religious perspective to allow the State of Israel to exist, and there are Jews who believe that this land has been promised to them by God, and that other non-Jews are simply inferior human beings and do not have the same rights.
It's incredible because in Idea City what we have been doing and in these programs, we have met a lot of people that have this big debate of who are we. And I mean, a lot of things looks like it comes from our genes, actually. And one idea is this tribalism, that to survive you have to feel that you belong to not only to some group, and that not only that you belong, but in a way that it's superior, and that your God is the correct God, or you're believing in not God, or in whatever. On the other hand, we have been understanding through all the people that we have been interviewing that there's a lot of cultural actually matters here, and that it's not so much like in our genes, but it's in our context. Also, a reason to survive and to gain power. But at the end, it's important to know the reasons, but it's much more important to know what will happen in the future. And more now than the world have a lot of scapegoats, and it has been part of the fear, for example, in the United States that you were talking about. If we talk now about the future, and if we could have this talk, I don't know, 300 years later or whatever, what do you expect that will happen?
Well, I think what will become very clear very soon, if it isn't to some people already, is that we simply don't have a choice but to consider each other equal, because we're equally vulnerable to the major challenges that threaten our survival. I mean, whether it's global warming, whether it's the threat of nuclear destruction, the challenges that we face are simply shared challenges that will affect all of us equally. We are mixing, you know, yes, we live in neighborhoods, we have our houses of worship, we have our cultural groups, but we are so mixed up with each other, and that will only increase. Where our populations will have so much diversity, we'll be happy to have our groups and our subgroups, but at the same time, we've got to realize that our survival is a shared survival. And the only way, I mean, clearly, the only way of ensuring that shared survival is through the reciprocal extension of equal rights. I think the biggest misconception that people have is that Muslims somehow accept terrorism as a legitimate act of resistance. Now, there are legitimate acts of resistance in every culture and in every country. Islam is not a pacifist religion, just as I believe most Christians and most Jews are not pacifists. They believe in legitimate acts of self-defense. But Islamic law has always recognized that terrorism is a heinous crime. It has always punished terrorism. And those who are committing terrorism now, who happen to be Muslims and who are justifying it in the name of Islam, are primarily targeting other Muslims. So more Muslims have died from these acts of terrorism than Americans or Westerners or Christians or others.
The motto of this festival this year is "Don't believe everything you think," and that's very important, mainly in terms of your stereotypes of the other. If we could play this game and I ask you, "Don't believe everything you think," how would you change? How would you close the sentence? How would you end it?
Don't believe everything you think about Muslim women.
Good. If I ask you, what's your most dangerous idea? Another very important question of the big questions that we are having in Idea City.
My most dangerous idea is that religious authority is in the hands of the believer.
Another question, in what do you strongly believe that you cannot prove?
I can't prove that the God that I feel and I love and gives me meaning exists.
What do you expect about the festivity of Idea City? Because we're looking forward to see you there, and it's really an honor to have you. But what do you expect about it?
Well, I expect it to be a great occasion for me to learn, first of all, to interact, and I'm just really excited about interacting with the audience and the people who are around. There's a lot of great things going on.
We are really excited about you coming to Mexico and to Puebla and to Idea City. And thank you very much for your time and your generosity.
You're welcome.
Gracias.
Thank you, my pleasure.
No, gracias. Pues, ¿qué les pareció? ¿Qué piensan de lo que piensa Ingrid Mattson? Esta gran mujer que tiene un gran historial. Por supuesto, ustedes podrán preguntarse, bueno, me quedé con la duda de por qué realmente vive en Estados Unidos. ¿Por qué se convirtió o no se convirtió al islamismo? ¿Qué fue primero, el novio, el amor o la religión? ¿Y qué tan trascendente es esto al final de cuentas? Por supuesto, ¿qué tantas falsedades hay en tantos prejuicios? ¿Cómo entender al otro? ¿Cómo entendernos a nosotros mismos? Son preguntas para la Ciudad de las Ideas en Puebla del 6 al 8 de noviembre. Pero esperemos que estas ideas le generen nuevas ideas para transformar al mundo. Muchas gracias.
Life is good. I really believe that.
La Ciudad de las Ideas, un festival sin precedentes, agradece el apoyo a las siguientes empresas socialmente responsables.